Welcome to our interview series on technology impact assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a visiting scientist at Arizona State University and a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute in Australia. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project, funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and our Indian counterpart, and it's been ongoing since November 2024. And in this series, we're focusing on technology impact assessment for peace and stability. And I'm joined today by a dear friend and colleague and collaborator, Professor Andrew Goldsmith. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Katina.
I want to start with, this interdisciplinary focus of yours. When I met you, I thought you had a couple of doctorates then. And now I know you do, one of them being an honorary doctorate, if I'm not mistaken, a higher doctorate at the London School of Economics. But what brought you into the fields of law, criminology, and social theory?
Okay. I guess my original interest was in, as a young person, having a job that would keep me alive and would serve a noble end or a worthwhile purpose. And law appealed to me more than perhaps social work at the time. I thought I was too young to be a social worker, but old enough to be a lawyer for some reason. Anyway, so law sort of drew me in, but then the criminal law aspect of law appealed to me more than many of the other aspects. So I was sort of intent on either practicing criminal law or studying criminology. Once I'd been in practice for a short period, and that led me overseas to study law and then criminology, and come back to Australia later on, do a bit more study in social theory. But yeah, so really it kicked off from an interest in crime and criminal law.
And do you have any advice for people starting out in academia today about the importance of interdisciplinarity?
Well, I think interdisciplinarity is a fundamental device for doing good research, or a way of doing so, a form of collaboration, a way of drawing insights from different fields. Uh, to study something like law as a young person and then to practice it was to make me realize that what happened in a courtroom, particularly something like a magistrate's court, was 100 miles away from what I was learning in a doctrinal sense in law school, so that you needed to bring psychology, sociology, something else to the table. So I became, I guess, more interested in the law in action than the law in the books, as people used to talk about. And interdisciplinarity is essential to that kind of bringing together of different perspectives.
And what have been the different sort of areas of focus that you've had in this field of law, criminology, and social theory? What do people know you for in your research, do you think?
Well, a lot of the work I've done is around governance, accountability of policing historically. But out of that, I guess increasingly an interest, as you would remember, interest in technology and how that was impacting on things like policing, how it was impacting on the way criminals were able to commit new forms of crime or existing forms of crime in a different means. So in the last 10, 15 years, technology as a kind of enabler of crime and criminal justice became a focus. But that built on a long time looking at policing, I guess, as the key institution of criminal justice that I did work on, transnational policing, accountability, corruption, anti-corruption, and the notion of trust. And I guess thinking about why people don't trust the police has become a key sort of orienting concern for a lot of the work I've done, say, in the last 25 years.
Would it be fair to say, as you've explored this entanglement or application of technology in policing, um, that you've had to assess technologies and how they're used by policing in other sectors?
Yeah, I think once inevitably you're talking about how policing is enabled positively or negatively by technology, one has to reckon with the technologies in the settings in which police use them. I mean, I have to say a lot of that assessment of a very informal kind has been secondhand rather than spending a lot of time watching police use them up close. I mean, coincidentally, I spent a little bit of time recently looking in police communications rooms and going on a foot patrol with police, where I was able to see how they use surveillance cameras, body-worn video, and some things like that. But that's unfortunately perhaps been a first-hand experience, a relatively minor part of my observations. But I realized probably 5 years ago that the material dimensions of crime and criminal justice was neglected by many scholars, and that we needed to really look closely at how technologies of whatever kind in the space that I was looking actually have their own agency, I guess, in the context of influencing. These are not just props in a play where the human actors are all the props matter enormously, and they are suggestive of scripts for action. They are providers of motivation for particular courses of action. So the materiality of technology, I guess, guns is one thing I focused on in some work about 5 or 6 years ago. One has to look at the technology in terms of the materiality, ease of use. For me, some things become too easy because of technology and not necessarily judicious or wise choices. So what are the factors of that technology that facilitate certain choices? And in the context of the internet and computers, I developed a concept of digital drift based on some criminological theory that would be familiar to a lot of people who studied criminology in the last 50 years, whereby environmental cues enable courses of action that would otherwise not be accessible or available or attractive. So the attractiveness of technology is one of the things that I've written about in the last few years, and the seductions, if you like, of cybercrime, and particularly the seductiveness of technology in generating and encouraging crime.
Talk to us about the early adoption of technology by the policing sector. First of all, do you think they are early adopters, given your studies?
I think they adopt probably around the same average time. I think perhaps sometimes they seem a bit slow. There's a lot of talk about technology, the importance of technology. Police often rebel against the introduction of new technologies. There's a grassroots resistance to some of these technologies because they enhance capabilities for surveillance of their workplace practices, or lack of accountable or good behaviour on the job. So there's always that kind of factor of police pushback, and also how police manipulate technologies to bypass accountability to fool their superiors. So that's sort of, I guess, part of the story about policing and new technologies. But I think increasing in recent years, the efficiency drives, police are looking more and more to technology to answer a lot of these questions. I don't think they like skilling up to use those technologies is often a challenge because they can't compete for the talent necessary, and that, I think that's an ongoing challenge for a lot of police agencies.
Prior to the introduction of new technologies within, say, the police force or forces, uh, are there any instruments that are used to assess the impact of that given technology? Do you know of any?
I'm not aware of any particular tool or methodology in that space. I think a lot of these tools are under assessed. I think a lot of police organisations have tended to rely upon the usual kind of big three, big four firms to do the kind of assessments of workplace practices, business effectiveness, in the way they do that through, I guess, looking at data on use of particular tools, evaluating experiences with those tools through interviews and surveys. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any sort of more detailed technologies assessments in wider use.
Are there particular types of personnel in policing um, that would say, oh, these are the top 10, technologies we should be looking at in the next few years, both for the introduction within the workplace and also among constituents, some of those being, of course, those in the criminal world uh, in their adoption. So are there like, watch out for these 10 technologies as they may be adopted in our workplace in the policing sector, or watch out for these top 10 tech. This is how they're being misused by criminals.
I guess there's two sides to that your question, and in terms of how police are looking at the field of technology today and saying, what's important. I think, coming to terms with big data, I guess, is one of the big challenges that I think still police are aware of, but are still working out how they can possibly draw upon the data that's available and use it. And I think, slowly there's improvement or greater use of integrating different data sources. The different kind of formats for a lot of visual recording data. It's been challenging police, I guess, in recent times with the mobile phone capturing data and CCTV and so on. So how to assimilate, how to store, how to analyze. And like, I guess, a lot of big data challenges, there doesn't seem to be enough capability to analyze the potential that this data holds. And I guess, in some ways, there's sort of a positive side to that, in the sense that a lot of people are very worried about police getting too much surveillance capability. But I think, technologies that the public are not generally aware of that are being increasingly used in policing and, I guess, defence contexts, where the average person in the street would be astonished at how much greater that surveillance capability is now, but it's not in the general public awareness, and police often, I guess, like people in defence, don't talk about it. So it's a fairly rarely known capability that's out there and currently used.
Would you say these technologies are being applied in the guise of peace and stability and the upholding of the rule of law? Uh, and can they cause chilling effects in society based on their actual presence?
I think there's, the double-faced or double-edged swords, of course, all these technologies, and that's a banal observation. But in the context of surveillance, I guess there are great hopes, of course, that crimes can be solved because of the recording from number plate readers, CCTV cameras, converging that information. We know that people who probably would have got away with serious crimes. There was a case of the ABC reporter in Melbourne who was followed home and so on, and that case was solved through the Jill Meagher case, through the combination of technologies. And people, I think, overwhelmingly would support that kind of integration application of technology. So for that round, and people's sense of security in public spaces, I mean, some people who have been surveyed, homeless people, people on the street, are very appreciative of what some of this surveillance technology can offer them. But on the other hand, of course, there's a kind of level of intrusion that can often seem excessive, and police drones overflying private backyards and that sort of thing. So it's a very mixed and complex and, I guess, changing field there, where the benefits and the detriments of technology are keenly contested and much debated. Interestingly, recently in prisons, I mean, prison authorities are contending with the drone invasions. Drones are being used, for example. Now, Amazon want to use drones to deliver books and meals and so on. Prison authorities in UK and elsewhere are fighting this sort of drone invasion, where criminals are using these technologies to bring contraband in. So, there's again dual use of things like drones for better and for worse.
Wonderful response. And I'm going to move to now this notion of technology impact assessment, which you've spoken about briefly, perhaps not as a term by itself, but in understanding that technologies have impacts and we need to assess them in particular
Mm.
vertical sectors like policing and defense. Um, when I say TIA or technology impact assessment, what comes to mind and what elements do you think need to be included in something called a technology impact assessment?
Well, it's a term that I've only, I guess, fairly recently thought about directly because of the involvement with this exercise or in the meetings leading up to it. But I mean, I guess one of the things that I've drawn from that experience, and I guess things before that, is identifying the range of interests that are germane, salient to that exercise, and and just naming them, identifying who they are, is a starting point. I think it's very easy to underestimate the kind of people or the impacts of these technologies unless one goes through a fairly thorough kind of canvassing exercise. So I think it's, as I said, something that probably hasn't been done very thoroughly, and that by turning one's mind to, one starts to broaden out a lot of the ethical as well as practical sides to that. So I guess, seeing where the accountability and the ethical dimensions of these exercises can be fleshed out and applied to these assessments, I guess, is something that interests me from my kind of background interest in integrity and accountability and, so the dual uses of technology.
I know from working with you in the past, you've consulted on different types of assessments that you've had to make in really specific contexts in the adoption of X or Y. Um, do you think assessments are a standalone artifact, like a white paper or an actual assessment outcome? Do you think it's a continual process where there needs to be engagement over time? How do you view the assessment of any technology, say in policing?
I think, to me, the answer is it needs to be something you can't sort of set and forget or do once and move on. I mean, technology, as you know, evolves, and the applications of it evolve and expand. So that something in one context can be tomorrow in a different context. So that kind of shifting, adaptation processes, I think, are inevitable and therefore beget a need for some sort of rolling or periodic review process. I mean, technologies, don't stay the same, and therefore we've got to take the similar approach in assessing them.
Thank you. Form factors, technologies that you've seen deployed for police, how have they changed since the beginning of your studies in this area to today?
Well, it depends which technology you're talking about. I mean, I think around the police car once was a huge innovation in policing, to be able to get in a car and drive from pillar to post. And then, of course, then we put mobile computer terminals in police cars. So there's kind of an escalation, upskilling, I guess, of the police car. And similar things are going on with, body worn video cameras that the police officers use. And, one can think of a lot of positive reasons why those cameras are useful for everybody, not just the police, but the public in terms of holding police accountable. But when you start feeding in a lot of the data sources that are now being fed into those cameras. I was reading something recently about, these cameras are no longer just about taking in and recording interactions on the street. They're also kind of capable of receiving and integrating information from various data banks. So the potentiality or the capability of some of these things is growing faster than many of us, again, I think, can keep up with. So these are kind of untested, I guess, in terms of some of the implications. That's why we have to keep watching them over time, because they don't stand still. And needless to say, there's a lot of commercial interests, and I think this point's come up in our previous conversations as a group, in innovating and expanding, and of course, accentuating the apparent need for this stuff. There's a kind of a fear factor, I guess, that helps promote some of these technologies, which again then process is of significance in terms of working out an assessment regime for that technology.
You alluded to third parties or private interests. Um, if you were undergoing a technology impact assessment in the context of policing, who would be the main stakeholders that you would study and consider as having involvement in the rollout of a new technology? For example, generative AI.
I mean, I guess generative AI has so many potential uses in policing, and I guess both in the uh, conceptualizing of what police do and how they operate on the ground. I mean, so that the range of people you'd want to talk to, I guess, is probably, I mean, I think a similar range of people you want to do with any kind of change in police practice. That, that the impact of the technology itself, I guess, is something that upon policing is something that, one would need some skilled input in. But the range of stakeholders would, I think, be pretty much the general public, a range of private sector actors, as we say, with stakes in the skin in the game, the police themselves of the different ranks. I think technology is often accepted at the top of organisations without much regard to the rank and file. So I think there's probably a scope there for greater participation across the range of positions and ranks in the police force. Yeah.
And the outcomes of these assessments, should they be public? Where could we put them, for example?
Yeah.
Where could they be placed to be accessible?
Well, I think, your question raises the parallel consideration of, what assessments do we do of the impact of legislations? We pass laws with an expectation that they will change a practice, diminish, and we're not very good at evaluating them. And to the extent we have those evaluations, they're precious and I think are important and part of the public dialogue around the exercise of those powers. So I think, it's the same for impact assessments of technology and policing or others. They should be in the public domain so that people can, I guess, appreciate what some of the implications are, and we can have a sensible conversation about that.
If we look at the practice of technology impact assessment across shores, say nation state to nation state in a bilateral context, do you think there could be joint TIAs being done between police forces, perhaps in Australia and India?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm thinking of examples closer to home, perhaps where there's more of a day-to-day relationship and where we have existing aid obligations. I mean, where we do policing, say, assistance in the Pacific. I mean, I think, the joint assessments would be particularly important there. But with India as well, whether we've got different cultural practices and implications for rollout that in Australia we wouldn't necessarily anticipate. We might overlook and vice versa. So I think, and of course, with global movements of people between countries like India and Australia, I guess that it sharpens up the importance of a better understanding what some of those differences are, as well as those similarities. So that sort of bilateral element, I think, particularly where there's other bases for regular interaction, which there are with India, as with our own region closer to home, speaks, I think, the importance of bilateral, yeah.
And where could a function like that sit? Do you think it sits within government in its own Office of Technology Assessment? Does it sit among consultants? Where does it fit in the vertical sector itself? Where would a instrument like that be practiced and by whom?
Yeah, we probably, I'm not aware of an agency where it would naturally sit currently. I mean, you might recall at one point in the state of Victoria, there was a law enforcement information commission. I can't remember the exact title, but there was a special body devoted to looking at how law enforcement was managing information. So you might need a sui generis institution, maybe building on some of the practices of a federal government agency, but where some of this stuff can be warehoused and analysed and shared and stuff, because I don't see it being a priority readily with any of the existing agencies of which I'm aware, albeit an important complementary function.
And would that function be there to raise awareness within, say, the police force, of people making procurement decisions there about new technologies and the spread of technology and new processes, or would it be um, somewhere else?
Well, I think, in the context of policing, I mean, some aspects of police technology acquisition and use would be of little or no public interest. It might be sort of something to do with the business processing or something, or the handling of, accounts or something. Things like procurement might be of broader interest, but then public interactions would be even wider interest. So, yeah, I think, there's going to be different demand, I suppose, depending on which technology we're talking about. But some of those technologies are very much in the space of public liberty, expression of individual freedom. And I think, one needs greater transparency and accessibility to those sorts of assessments where they can be, I think, integrated into discussions. Because I think, there is a kind of a lacuna in people's understanding of technology in the street. As I said, there are very different aspects to technologies. There are different powers, greater powers in many instances than I think most of us appreciate. I mean, I'm constantly surprised when I hear about the latest technology in law enforcement or policing, because it just takes things to another level. And I think people who don't study policing or aren't, but are worried about individual freedom, they need to be brought into the conversation and in a way that's, open and comprehensible.
That leads us to a question of the effectiveness of uh, documentation or processes surrounding technology impact assessment for them to be effective and be guidances that governments or policing administration can adopt, what do they have to look like? That's something I've been thinking about greatly regarding what is the outcome of a TIA? How can it be used tangibly uh, by governments? Often consultants will do a lot of reporting and a lot of assessing, and then it'll be an important document in order to make a decision. But what kinds of formats do you think TIAs should encompass?
From a kind of translation or implementation point of view. Yeah.
Exactly, that are usable to a stakeholder who's asked for one.
Yeah, well, I guess the attention economy, our understanding of the attention economy suggests these things need to be pretty pithy and maybe visually strong, but I'm not
Mm.
sure there's a single template in that space that I'm aware of. But I mean, there needs to be plain English or plain language, I guess, expression of these things, because so it can get to the main audiences, whether they be political or in different sectors of society. I mean, it astonishes me how many people in elected politics in the US don't read bills, that they approve. It's come to light recently in some of the developments in America. A lot of politicians admit they haven't read the bills they've approved. I mean, we don't want people making decisions ideally without having some reference to the evidence and the arguments. And so, I mean, that's got to be the aim, I guess, is to broaden that kind of communicability. But I don't know there's a simple answer to that.
And you mentioned that both sort of context, historical context, benefits, anticipated um, negatives and disadvantages of adopting a technology might be in a TIA. Um,
Yeah.
what kinds of formats could that advantages and disadvantages come in? Um, are you someone who, for example, who espouses scenarios or case studies, or how would you um, present anticipated consequences that we can't really prove today, but they've been speculated through your research?
Yeah, well, I think some kind of you mentioned case studies or scenarios, but ways that enable people to kind of reckon with the particularity and the immediacy of some of these things. I mean, if one was to explain to somebody in the community that this new police technology could be operated from a drone or a helicopter hundreds of meters above their head and could be downloading material from their mobile phones without their knowledge, a lot of people would probably say, well, I'm very surprised that happened. And how does that possible? But I mean, I might be overstating some of the powers of current technology slightly. I'm not across all that, but I think, as I keep saying, I'm always surprised to know what is increasingly possible in this space. But if people don't appreciate that, then they can't make sensible contributions, or they may not form the right kind of objections or necessary kind of pushback on some of that. If these powers are going to exist anyway, then people need to know how to understand them and potentially to hold those using them to account by whatever standards we choose to apply.
So the social theory aspect of your work interests me and intrigues me a lot. Um, when you're studying technology, do you think there is always a social dimension to technology?
Yes.
How? What did you what what gripped you in your studies and what propelled you that way? And how have you applied that social theory side to your work?
Well, I guess that the whole internet sort of cyber dimension for me, as I said, was quite important in recognizing the kind of the breadth of audience, the breadth of participation that these technologies, the kind of entry barriers were very low. That I mean, as a criminologist, one's tempted to say that people who commit crime are kind of exceptional individuals, when social theory will say, well, hang on, systems can make people criminal. Otherwise, good people, if you like, can turn bad because of their environment. Well, of course, the environment in which a lot of people exist, we're talking now and so on, our kids exist in much more even, is a technological, is a digital one. And so how is that environment impacting on us, whether it be, social media or online access to pornography or online radicalization? But, the role of technology there is indisputable. And it has a kind of compelling quality for a lot of young people. It has a plausibility, it has accessibility, it's affordable. It's not guns aren't affordable like social media is affordable. Weapons are harder to get, but everybody can sit down almost, it seems, young people with a mobile phone and get into a realm where the technology is playing a formative role in them doing transgressive or bad things. So how is it that technology is tilting the balance, if you like, for people who might otherwise do nothing bad to inclining them more to do certain things from a chronological point of view we're concerned about?
Do you think the law is slow in responding to advances in technology?
I think catch up is always a factor with law reform. I mean, I trained originally as a lawyer. I don't see myself now as a lawyer, but any observer, I think of, recent trials in the court, some of the mushroom case comes to mind. You can see a lot of lawyers struggle with understanding science, understanding technology. There's always a kind of a delay and some of us are not as able to appreciate, I guess, what technology threatens as well as enables. And therefore you're always it's a catch up mode. So I think, and probably to some extent, law is not leading too much. It's not a bad thing, but perhaps appreciating some of the risks is something that law is not necessarily good at. But then again, we don't want the law to be over sensationalizing or get in the throes of moral panics, which can drive bad decisions in this space.
Do you think we need to qualify more lawyers with a technological awareness? Do you think that's happening?
I think it's happening certainly in at Flinders Law School. They talk a lot about technology and, as you say, familiarizing law students with how to operate with technology packages in practice and other areas of professional life. I think a lawyer who turns their back on technology is looking back to a 19th century time now and is not going to thrive or adapt well to their environment. So I think I think it's inevitable and important.
One of my final questions is if you see any shortcomings with the process that we might name technology impact assessments or limitations or misuse even of a TIA instrument.
I guess one of the things that sort of came up with in the conversations we had was, I mean, appreciating that technologies can have different resonances in different environments, and people and different contributors to this conversation can obviously have a variety of animating interests and priorities and how that technology works or doesn't work potentially for them. So, reckoning with that kind of diversity of expectations and interests, I guess, and balancing them in some bilateral exercise is probably something that one can't take for granted, at least. One has to sort of be attentive to the possibility that those are a drag factors or, create some sort of resistance to some simple implementation of a assessment exercise.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for all of that so far. I have just one question that I ask of all interviewees, and that is there anything else you wish to add that has arisen in your mind as you've come into, you know, dialogue with this notion of technology impact assessment, or anything we didn't cover that you wanted to add?
Um, no, I mean, I felt, as I said, as an outsider in the sense I hadn't been through an explicit exercise. I mean, peripherally, I've talked about my interest in technology, one form of the other. But I guess, one of the challenges will be, I guess, as I said, identifying the commonality of interests that would drive these bilateral exercises. And I think we've discussed already there are opportunities and value from that, but how you get to that process and sustain a collaborative approach going forward, I think, it remains to be seen and it could be the next challenge, I guess.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew Goldsmith, from Flinders University. We're very grateful for your time and your intellect. It's dawned on me, actually, the more I've spoken to you today, that there are some people who have championed technology impact assessments without even realizing that they've been doing them for so
Very,
long.
very kind
Uh,
of you.
I, I really think knowing your work and knowing how much you've um, shared with so many different clients and so many different universities, uh, that your work actually touches on so many of the things that we need to be astute about regarding impact assessments. And um, criminology is one of these elements, history is another that's been mentioned by others, and this notion of the socio-technical and the environment that you just mentioned is very
Mm.
powerful. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Katina.